Hello everyone, welcome to Balkwell's Books. This is Balkwell, and by this, I mean me. Welcome to my pleasure dome. Today we are discussing the novel The Brothers Karamazov by Fyodor Dostoevsky. Now, this is an incredibly large novel full of very interesting and enjoyable things to talk about, so of course, due to the nature of recording a probably around half-hour YouTube video in which I talk in an unscripted fashion, what I will be providing today will not be comprehensive, and instead I will focus on a few aspects of the novel that I consider the most interesting and perhaps the most important. I will be talking about events from the entirety of the novel, in case you're worried about that. I will say, however, that, like I mentioned before, a man talking about this novel for about 30 minutes in a rather haphazard fashion can in no way get at or ruin the enjoyable and lovable aspects of the book that you will find by reading it yourself. Which I would encourage everybody to do if they are so inclined, whether they know what happens in it or not. I'm recording this following my second reading of the novel, and I enjoyed it even better the second time, as is always the case with a truly great book. So, The Brothers Karamazov was published in the year 1880, technically across the years 1879 and 1880, for it was published serially, and it's Dostoevsky's final novel. Unfortunately, he died about several months after finishing this book. And what's even more unfortunate about that is that he had planned to write a sequel, which, of course, he never got around to, being dead and all. In the introduction, or the sort of preface to this novel, he talks about the sequel, vaguely. He mentions that he wants to write 2 novels about Alyosha Karamazov. And we even have, evidence from his notes and letters, a vague outline of what that might have looked like, which, reading it a second time, I grew increasingly more full of grief, I suppose, about the fact that this novel doesn't exist, because I think it would have been very interesting. But that is neither here nor there. So, to introduce Dostoevsky very briefly, I'd like to reference a tweet I saw probably 4 or 5 years ago or something like this. And it might not even have been a tweet, but in my head it's a tweet. This person said something to the effect of, I read Dostoevsky in the past and I thought all of his characters were totally crazy. But reading it again in the 2020s, I find that it all makes sense. Now, I don't necessarily agree entirely with what this person said, because I think the characters are still crazy, and I think they always made sense. This person just wasn't able to discover that fact. But I think there is a sense in which the world that Dostoevsky was inhabiting, and more particularly the way people perceived the world they lived in, is analogous in a certain sense to the way people perceive the world they live in today, at least in the Western world, and particularly among people on the internet, and the political side of the internet, you might say, but really the internet in general. And as the internet is also, culture at large, we can say culture at large. And so what is the basis of this sort of analogy? So 19th century Russia was a time in which great societal changes were occurring. But aside from that, it was a time in which there was a sort of expectation or an anxiety about great changes continuing to occur in the future, and that these changes would take the form of some sort of crisis. And so you had a wide variety of reactions to this sort of anxiety and a large amount of political extremism and a divide between the older generations and the younger generations. The younger generations are growing up in this time of change. They might feel a hope for the future, and they might feel this desire to change it in a way that fits with their worldview. Whereas the older generation grew up in a world that felt a lot more stable, whether it was or was not is beyond the point. It felt very stable, and that they are very put off by these changes and want to counteract them in some way, which is the sort of reactionary idea or ideal. So, without getting into the specifics of what was happening, and we can point to things like the abolition of serfdom as a very major political change in Russia. But the thing about the abolition of serfdom is you don't just abolish serfdom and then suddenly everyone's equal and everything's great. It's one of those sort of almost symbolic gestures or actions that point towards a possible future. But it doesn't create that future. It creates the conditions of the possibility of that future. But still, just by abolishing serfdom, there is still plenty of class disparity and conflict and wealth disparity within Russia at the time. Maybe an analogy would be the emancipation or the abolition of slavery in the United States. Obviously, we can say that was a very good thing that happened, but it's not like one day black people were slaves and the next day they're equal citizens and everything's perfectly fine. There was still plenty of work that had to be done, that is continuing to be done. There was still systematic repression and racism, and it didn't go away. It only pointed to the possibility of equality in the future, which people uh, had to continue to fight for, continue to experience crises and ups and downs that continue to this day. So, um, but in the broader point, what I'm trying to say is that times of change are not just uh, difficult because of the changes themselves, but because of this instability, this idea that things are going to continue to change. So this might give us some sort of perspective on our modern world, just in terms of the fact that there is this feeling that there are two possibilities, maybe that the current series of crises are things, the sort of last gasp of an old order of the world that will be finally crushed, and a newer and better way of doing things will emerge in the future. Or it could just be that things are just getting worse, that we're experiencing a downfall, and then things will be very, very bad, even worse than ever before. The truth of the matter is probably that crises will continue to occur perpetually, and that what will change is whether the people who are in positions to talk about them believe they are crises or not. We can look at 1950s United States and say, well, everybody was doing good. They had cars and they had a house and everybody had a good job, boop boop a doo. Really, that was true of the white middle class in the United States was doing very well, and their quality of life was increasing dramatically. But it would be ridiculous to say that there were not continuing crises occurring in the United States at the time, and that people were not generally living in a state of anxiety and fear, as we often do. Is one of the things that we do. So all that was just sort of a tangent about nothing of relevance to anything. So let's talk about books, because in reality, books are the only thing that is important, and all the other stuff can suck an egg. So let's talk about the Brothers Karamazov. Why don't we? So it makes sense to begin with who the Brothers Karamazov in fact are. There are three brothers. One of them, the youngest, is named Alyosha. He is not quite a monk or a novice, but he lives in a monastery and is sort of a I don't know what the exact word I want to say is, but he lives in a monastery and he's sort of an acolyte of this elder named Zosima. And his view of the world is very much that of a sort of Christian love and forgiveness. He's not particularly spiritual in the sense of being mystical or otherworldly. Instead, the way his religious feelings come out, I suppose, the way they affect his worldview is this sort of not quite innocence or naivety, but a general desire to look at the world goodly, to see it in its best form, and that is a type of love. And he's someone who is trying to forgive and accept the people around him, who might not be doing things that are that good in themselves, but he feels that a good way of approaching the world is through this love and acceptance. So that's Alyosha. And you could say that he is the sort of uh, main character of the novel. He's the person who we sort of follow around from place to place the most. He's in the majority of the scenes. And his perspective ends up being, to a certain extent, the perspective that we will take on throughout the novel. And I'll talk about that a bit later. So Alyosha has two brothers. And there's a very complicated... Their family is very complicated because their dad's a bit of a jerk. There's two separate moms involved who are both dead. We're not going to get into all that. But his second brother is named Dmitri. This is the brother he sort of grew up with more so. And Dmitri... Let's put aside Dmitri for a second. His eldest brother is Ivan, and Alyosha and Ivan don't have that strong of a relationship. They met, somewhat recently, as before the events of the novel. And Alyosha is still sort of feeling out Ivan in a certain sense. So Ivan, in contrast to Alyosha, is an atheist and has a sort of nihilistic type of atheism. He's reacting very strongly against the Orthodox Christianity of the time and sort of embracing the new sort of scientific worldview and also embracing a sort of Nietzschean abolishment of standards of morality. That one of the things about Nietzsche is this sense of being able to create your own morality, that these old morals are no longer relevant, they're no longer appropriate to the world that we live in today, that they are repressive, and that we need to create our own way of judging actions in the world. And this is sort of where Ivan is. However, it's very clear that Ivan feels an inner moral or religious sense that is constantly in conflict with his professed atheistic ideals. And it's not necessarily that he believes in God and is trying to pretend he doesn't, but there's a conflict within him between these two sides that he finds it difficult to reconcile. And one of the main ways this is expressed in the novel is through the character of Smerdyakov. Smerdyakov is the illegitimate, possibly the illegitimate son. It's very strongly implied or stated that he is the illegitimate son of Fyodor Pavlovich Karamazov, who was the father of Alyosha, Ivan, and Dmitri. Because he's illegitimate, he is a servant in Fyodor's household. He's not a proper son or anything like that, and he works as a cook. And he has a sort of very inflated sense of his self. And at some point in the past, him and Ivan spoke a lot. And he began to take on a lot of Ivan's professed ideals in terms of this new sense of morality. You create your own morality. But he doesn't have this innate religious or moral sense that Ivan does. He doesn't have this inner conflict. And so he's able to embrace this amorality in a much more insidious and maybe selfish manner. And when Ivan is confronted with this fact, confronted with this sort of bizarro mirror image of himself in Smerdyakov, it horrifies him, and it makes him go a little bit crazy. And at the end of the novel, there's this sense in Ivan that he created Smerdyakov by introducing him to all these ideas, and by creating him, he takes on a moral responsibility for the actions of Smerdyakov. And this is very important, because Smerdyakov does some bad stuff. Now, the third brother is Dmitri. And Dmitri is almost impossible to really describe in any simple way. Dmitri, in terms of his role, he's engaged in conflict with the father, Fyodor. He is the most antagonistic toward the father. And the reasons for this are manifold, but one of the main ones is that they're both chasing the same girl. This is sort of where we find ourselves at the beginning of the novel, that they both are chasing after this woman named Grushenka. And it's hard to tell the extent to which Fyodor actually is going after this girl for his own sake, or whether he's doing it deliberately to provoke Dmitri. They have this, just this enmity between them that can never really be abolished, and they're both sort of feeding into it constantly. And so what happens in the novel is that Fyodor Pavlovich Karamazov is killed. And all of the facts of the matter point to Dmitri as the murderer. And one of these facts being that Dmitri ran around for several months saying, "I'm gonna kill my dad." Then he beat his dad up and said, "Next time I'm gonna kill you." So really there's a lot of evidence. And one of the more interesting aspects of the novel is that even though all of these things happen, and we are shown it all happening, we still don't want to believe that Dmitri killed his father. And that's kind of interesting. So essentially the structure of the novel is we have a large part where we're introduced to these three characters and they're running around within the conflicts that they're having. Then the father is killed, Dmitri is imprisoned, and the novel ends with a court hearing in which it is to be decided whether Dmitri is guilty or not guilty. This is the general structure of the novel. And this court scene introduces an essential concept for our understanding of these characters and our understanding of the nature of this novel itself. And this comes from the speech of the defense attorney Fetyukovich. And essentially what he says, it's a very simple thing. He says, psychology is like a stick with two ends. So what does he mean by this? Well, the prosecution has just given their speech. And during his speech, the prosecutor paints a portrait of Dmitri. And the portrait he paints is of a person who killed his dad. And he goes into the psychological meaning or basis behind all the actions that Dmitri takes before and after and during this murder, and sort of deduces a portrait of a sort of unfavorable portrait of Dmitri as by far the most likely person to have committed this crime. and someone who is very guilty and should be punished. That's sort of the portrait that he paints. And not only this, but Dmitri as a sort of weak-minded individual who murders for the sake of money because of desperation. That's important. That the father had money that Dmitri felt was his or felt that he needed, and that's why he murdered. So the defense attorney stands up and says, psychology is a stick with two ends. And what he then goes on to do is paints an entirely different portrait of Dmitri using the same facts, these same witness testimonials that were the evidence for the prosecution, and uses them to create a portrait of Dmitri as a person who could not possibly have killed his father, who has his faults and who has his sort of eccentricities, perhaps, to put it lightly, and who does a great amount of harm to everybody around him, but who is at heart noble and who has a sense of honor that would prevent him from committing this murder. And so we have these two psychological portraits of Dmitri that are presented to us at the end of the novel. This is our stick with two ends. And what this does is call into focus our own portrait of Dmitri that we have created. It makes us contemplate the portrait that we have painted, because we can recognize that neither of these portraits presented feel accurate to us. They both have a goal in mind, like a sort of they both have an interest in presenting him one way or the other professionally. And in attempting to simplify or reduce Dmitri to something that can be portrayed in a psychological portrait, they miss something essential about him. Now, we may feel that our portrait, our interpretation of Dmitri is more accurate. And the reason for this is because we have access to some more information about Dmitri than they might have. The book contains a lot, or the narrator of the book, who is some unnamed person who lives in the town, presents us with information that probably wouldn't be relevant to the case and therefore wouldn't factor into the way that the defense and the prosecution are viewing Dmitri. But we have access to all this history, and more importantly, we have access to Alyosha's view of things. All this being the case, we come to understand that we don't have direct access to Dmitri's interiority. That because the narrator is just some random guy who can tell us what happened, what things were done and things that were said, we don't have that we are in the same position as these attorneys in trying to make a final judgment on Dmitri. That we can look at what he said, we can look at what he did, but we don't quite understand him. We can never quite understand him fully. Now, Dmitri does a lot of things that don't quite make sense. And there are things that he is able to rationalize or explain in a way that almost makes sense emotionally if we are willing to empathize with him. And there are things he does that don't make sense no matter what we do. And part of the reason for this is that we are caught between Dmitri's view of himself from what he says and Alyosha's view of Dmitri, which is that of love and forgiveness. Now, to get to the first, Dmitri's view of himself, the way he speaks of himself, is as a weak person, as a scoundrel. And when someone takes a sort of creates a negative self-image of themselves, essentially what they're doing is giving themselves permission to act according to this negative self-image. So if you're convinced that you're an idiot and you keep saying, I'm an idiot, you're basically giving yourself permission to act stupidly because you're saying it's in my nature to do so. Dmitri, by continuously calling himself a scoundrel and thinking of himself as a scoundrel, gives himself permission to act in ways that are reckless and that harm others. And even though he has a sense of morality that tells him, like, he's able to recognize that these things are wrong and that they shouldn't be done and that they are causing harm, not only to others, but really to himself, his belief that he is a scoundrel is what allows him to do these things. And he does them and says, that was wrong, that was stupid, but I'm a scoundrel, so that's the kind of thing I do. You could argue, perhaps, that his sense of himself as a scoundrel comes from the fact that he recognizes his father as a scoundrel and says, well, I am the son of this guy who sucks so bad, so clearly I'm going to suck pretty bad too. And that despite this sense of honor or this sense of dignity that I have about myself that says I shouldn't act like a total buffoon, I'm going to do it anyway. That's just my nature, right? So he's essentially forgiving himself in advance, but in a very negative fashion. So we have that view of Dmitri. And we can, to a certain extent, empathize with him because, of course, we all have our own self-image and no way really of measuring whether it's accurate or not. And our self-image causes us to act in ways that can be contradictory or very strange to an outside observer. And part of the reason we want to empathize with Dmitri is because of the perspective of Alyosha. Now, Alyosha is a bit of a idealistic character, not in the sense that he himself is idealistic, but his presentation is somewhat idealistic. And I believe that this would have been mitigated slightly by the novel's planned sequel, but of course that doesn't exist. So there. We can see in Alyosha sort of a development, I suppose, of a character from one of Dostoevsky's previous novels, The Idiot. In that novel, we have Prince Mishkin, and Mishkin is a sort of Christ-like figure only in his meekness and his naivety. And this naivety, this innocence, basically makes him kind of stupid. And in the book, he is sort of cast about this way and that by various characters and events. And in that novel, I think one of my problems with the novel is that this character of Mishkin, because he's so lacking in agency and sort of literary power, the book ends up getting sort of distracted and diverged in all sorts of different manners and ends up somewhat incoherent. The difference in the Brothers Karamazov is that Alyosha, although he has a sense of innocence, he's very much not naive. He's in fact sort of wise and worldly beyond his years. And his Christ-likeness manifests in this sort of universal love or forgiveness. Now, of course, this love and forgiveness is going to be centered around his family. Mishkin in The Idiot doesn't have people in the novel who are as close or important, who have such strong connections to him, which I think is another major difference. So because Alyosha has these people around him who he's very strongly connected with, this is what gives the novel this sort of coherence in following his reactions or his perspective on the things that are going on with these other characters who are doing all these crazy, wild, different things, but which remain connected to him very strongly. So what I'm trying to get at is that Alyosha has this love for Dmitri. And this love is unconditional. So no matter how much Dmitri wishes to destroy himself, no matter how much Dmitri might wish or sort of attempt to alienate himself from Alyosha out of some sort of strange fear or view that he's not worthy of Alyosha's love, no matter what Dmitri does to other people outside of this, Alyosha is always going to look at him and try to see the best, and try to forgive him, and try to accept him the way he is. Alyosha doesn't say, sometimes he says, hey, maybe you shouldn't do that, or maybe you shouldn't do this, but he doesn't fundamentally try to change Dmitri. Instead, he says, I'm always here. I love you no matter what. Go ahead and do what you will. Even if you alienate yourself from everybody else in the entire town, I'm still here. And that's a very powerful thing for a person to have. Because we have that knowledge of Alyosha's feelings, and because we are, to a certain extent, following him around in the novel, we take on a bit of that. We take on a bit of that in our view of Dmitri. That we want to accept him, that we want to forgive him, even if we recognize him as acting recklessly and irrationally and badly. And I think this acceptance is sort of central. And I think it points at something that is also pointed at by the two portraits painted of Dmitri by the lawyers. Essentially, there is an unknowableness to Dmitri. He's very confusing, and he's very complicated. And even after almost 800 pages of experiences that are either directly or indirectly related to Dmitri and his inner states and his exterior actions, we leave the novel with this feeling that we can't quite know him fully. That there's something in between the testimonials of the prosecution and the defense that cannot be stated and cannot really even be comprehended by us. And if you think about it, this is true of everybody we know. And in a broader sense, this is true of everything we know. That we do not have the ability to grasp things fully, to comprehend them fully without little gaps. And these little gaps are the nature of freedom. Now, what do I mean by this? I don't know. Now, there's a view of the world that states that if you had access to all the facts and all the facts of the universe, you could recreate a simulation of the universe that would come out exactly as it has come out this time. And theoretically, that is entirely true. The difficulty, of course, comes with attaining all the facts of the universe, which is very difficult. And we know it's very difficult because attaining all the facts about any particular little thing is essentially impossible. And these gaps in our knowledge is what gives us a sense of freedom, because it means that everything is not determined, because we cannot determine it, right? Whether there is some being that could determine everything and know exactly how things are going to turn out, it is impossible for us as human individuals, or even as a human collective, to gain access to that at all. So whether we do or do not have freedom, we have a sense of freedom that comes from these little gaps in understanding that contain potential, right? This lack of knowledge is potential freedom. Now, I don't want to get into this too much because I'm already losing myself a little bit. But what I want to say is that one of the great aspects of this novel is how it emphasizes these little gaps that create freedom. And that it emphasizes, by its presentation of Dmitri in the courtroom, our lack of ability to fully comprehend another human being, that we are always interpreting them through exterior actions and exterior words, things they say. And even of ourselves, like Dmitri's perhaps inaccurate self-image, we all have inaccurate self-image. And although you could say we have all the facts of the case regarding our own nature and our own being, we still don't have full self-knowledge. And that this lack of full self-knowledge is what gives us a sense of freedom. And that we don't know exactly what we're going to do. We don't know what we should do. we don't barely even know what we have done. And I think when we look at the Brothers Karamazov, we are left with this sense of ambiguity, that we don't quite understand exactly what happened. And I could get a little bit more into this. I think I won't, because this video is already quite long. If you've read the book, if you think about the final confrontation between Ivan and Smerdyakov, and think about the fact that this is immediately followed by Ivan meeting the devil in his bedroom, how confident can we be of the testimony of Ivan in this matter, right? Because the book's not written by Ivan, and even if it was, I mean, whatever. The book's written by this person who has clearly gathered all this information from people. He's not saying that all this exactly happened. He's saying that somebody said this happened, that Ivan believes that this is the case, right? Ivan is somewhat unreliable. He has a bit of a brain fever at the end of the novel. So while our initial instinct is to treat the words of the novel infallibly and say, oh, well, the novel presents this conversation with Ivan and Smerdyakov this way, therefore Smerdyakov must have done this thing, can we really trust that? And I think that's just one major example of this novel sort of reveling in ambiguity. Now, another factor here, but a factor here that would probably be very important to Dostoevsky, is a biblical concept: judge not, lest ye be judged. So we have this sort of almost farcical courtroom scene in which these people are trying to create their psychological reconstructions of what happened. Who's the only person who knows what happened? It's God, right? So this is presenting the fallibility of human knowledge, and because of the fallibility of our knowledge, this also is the fallibility of our judgment. So if we try to judge Dmitri using the things that we know about him, it will always be inaccurate, and that he cannot be judged properly in this fashion. The only person who can judge him would be God. Now that's Dostoevsky's Christian perspective. I don't necessarily share it. You might not necessarily share it. It's important to point it out because I don't want you to get confused by all the things that I'm saying that are really only my own ideas about the novel. But if I were to ask myself, what is Dostoevsky trying to present with all of this, that would be my guess. Judge not, lest ye be judged. And I think from the character of Alyosha, his acceptance, his love of Dmitri is encouraging us to love Dmitri. And instead of attempting to judge him and decide whether he's guilty or not guilty according to our worldly standards, perhaps instead we should choose to love him and choose to accept him. And I think that's a very beautiful final message of the novel, or final view. To a certain extent, one of the great things about this novel is that it is allowing us briefly, if you call 800 pages briefly, while we're reading, to inhabit the worldview of Alyosha and to incorporate his view of things into our own. Now, we may not go out there and love and forgive and accept in the way he does. We may not even think that's a very good idea. But I think it is very valuable for us to gain that from him. And that's one of the great beauties of the novel. So while there is this great ambiguity about it, and I think that's what makes the novel so interesting, really what makes any great novel great, and then it has these little gaps, as I mentioned, where we can continually discuss and continually talk and read the book over and over and always gain something new from it because we never have full understanding. That is great, but what is also great is recognizing our fallibility, and not only recognizing it in a sort of metaphysical or a theoretical sense, but truly recognizing it and incorporating it into our interactions with others. Um, that's a really beautiful thing, and that's what I would like to leave you with today. So, goodbye.